Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a robust crowd attending a discussion of and a lecture on all things papal, especially the Renaissance papacy. I think I have Francis I to thank in part for the large crowd and probably also the word Renaissance. You probably remember the scene towards the beginning of the MGM 1939 classic film, The Wizard of Oz. Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, comes gliding down from the sky in a giant pink bubble to greet a wide-eyed Dorothy Gale, who herself just moments before had touched down along with her dog and her house in Munchkinland. Glinda's barely out of her bubble when she asks Dorothy a very pointed question. Are you a good witch or a bad witch? To which a still more bewildered Dorothy replies, why, I'm not a witch at all. Ever since I began in earnest my research on the Renaissance papacy, I have repeatedly found myself face to face with what I've come to call my Dorothy question. Conversation usually goes something like this. Oh, so you study the Renaissance. What's your own area of specialty? I work on the Renaissance papacy, and in particular on a pope by the name of Pius II. Oh, was he a good pope or a bad pope? Now, it isn't hard to see where this question comes from. The Renaissance papacy, indeed the papacy in general, has a justifiable reputation for highs and lows. Many of those highs are identified in its rich cultural legacy. The Renaissance popes helped to rebuild the city of Rome. They commissioned Italy's premier artists and architects to build, paint, and sculpt on their behalf. And so it is to them that we owe some credit, at least, for giving us breathtaking works like these. And then there are the lows. Popes who were real fathers as well as the Holy Father, who dirtied their hands and souls with conspiracy and murder, who bribed their way to the papal throne and then spent their pontificates in debauchery. Poster child for the bad Renaissance popes, and one who exhibited all of the above behaviors, is, of course, one of the men who, appropriately enough, appears on the poster for this lecture, Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. He is famous, or should I say infamous, in part because of Machiavelli, one of the most recognizable, influential, and well-read authors even today. Alexander VI, Machiavelli observes, never did anything but con people. And Machiavelli goes on to immortalize Alexander's son, Cesare, as the model Renaissance prince. More recently, the Borgia Pope's dirty laundry has been aired to a still wider audience on Showtime and CTV. Now, I'll confess, while I've understood where the Dorothy question was coming from, for a long time it really bothered me. It bothered me because I never knew how I should answer it. Pius II, or as I often call him, my Pope, resists this easy kind of categorization. And this probably helps to explain why someone like him, a towering figure on the 15th-century European stage, both before and during his papacy, doesn't have much purchase in popular culture today. So trying to fit him into the rather nebulous categories of good or bad, I'd never be able to explain who Pius really was and why he was so fascinating to study. More generally, the Dorothy question left me feeling that the whole period of the Renaissance papacy was somehow being straitjacketed. Just as there is about Pius, I thought, there is so much more to the Renaissance popes than just good and bad. Or was there? One reason I started to rethink my position was because of the buzz around this man. And if you don't recognize him behind the red clown nose, then it's time you crawled out from under your rock. Ever since he was elected Pope last year, the pictures and pronouncements of Pope Francis I have been grabbing headlines, capturing the attention of the world, and leading many down the roadways of the social media all the way to Rome. As of yesterday, more than 3.5 million people follow Pope Francis on Twitter. More often than not, the constant conversation about Francis is framed in terms of whether he is, and why he is, a good pope or not. And while it is not unanimous, the verdict so far is an overwhelming thumbs up. And he's earned his laurels as good pope from some very unlikely sources. For example, talking heads on the very left-leaning U.S. cable news network MSNBC have enthusiastically pronounced him, quote, the best pope ever, unquote. Earlier this week, it was revealed that in a wiretapped conversation in an Italian prison, two high-powered mafia bosses praised the pontiff as, quote-unquote, a really good guy. So, in part drawn in by this Francis phenomenon, and at the same time writing about the Renaissance papacy, I started to loosen my thinking a bit and came to the realization that the question of whether Renaissance popes are good or bad actually goes to the very heart of what the Renaissance papacy is all about. Now, presumably the best way, the most objective way, to figure out whether a pope is a good one or a bad one, we need to determine if he is fulfilling his job description. But if you had asked people in Western Europe in the 15th and early 16th centuries to write the job description for the Pope, you'd discover pretty quickly that it was impossible to find any kind of consensus. Of course, the Renaissance was not the first time when people had differed about the criteria of a good Pope, but never before had the disagreements been so sharp. Never before had there been such a wide spectrum of competing visions. Never before had these conflicting viewpoints found such strong support in canon law, biblical exegesis, political theory, and historical precedent. And in such firm commitment within the ranks of the clergy, secular rulers, and the laity more broadly. Never before had there been so much at stake with which vision of the good Pope would win out. It's for this reason that I concluded it actually makes a great deal of sense to examine the Renaissance papacy through the lenses of good and bad popes. Not because the institution was unusually populated by people who could easily be crowned with either devil's horns or angel's halos. No, because the Renaissance papacy was defined first and foremost by a raging and wide-ranging debate about exactly who had earned the halo and who deserved the horns, and because the failure to resolve that debate had momentous consequences for the Western Church. So, for the next 45 minutes or so, as promised in the poster for this talk, I'll take you on a tour of some of the good and the bad popes of the Renaissance. I have to be selective here. This is a period that spans over 100 years, starting in about 1417 and ending in 1534. And those starting and ending points will become clearer over the course of my talk. It encompasses the reigns of 14 different popes and one anti-pope, for good measure. The central aim of this tour is to illuminate for you how in the Renaissance good popes were also bad popes, and bad popes were also good popes. And at the same time, why? Why was it exactly that for people in the Renaissance, the Dorothy question yielded so many conflicting answers? We'll start with a little bit of backstory, and with it come the first answers to the why questions. Why question? Why the idea of the good pope was viewed in so many different ways. I can answer this question, really, in 3 words: the 14th century. The 1300s were a grim period in the history of Western Europe, a time of crippling climate change, unrelenting famine that stretched for years, the collapse of major banks, not to mention the Black Death. It was also a crisis for the Church and for its highest office, the papacy. The century kicks off with a face-off between 2 powerhouses. Boniface VIII, a pope who topped all others before and after him with claims to papal supremacy, the reach of the pope's authority. A face-off between him and the decidedly unintimidated King of France, so determined to defy Boniface's attempts to govern the clergy in his kingdom that he sent a bunch of royal thugs down to Rome to kidnap him. They didn't succeed, but a kidnapping of a different sort followed shortly thereafter. From 1309 to 1378, the popes resided in Avignon, in what is now southern France. One of Italy's greatest intellectuals, Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, used the Old Testament to condemn this period as the Babylonian captivity. The popes weren't literally held hostage by the French king, but given the influence they had over the papacy, Petrarch concluded, they might as well have been. The papacy's 7-decade sojourn in Provence had other memorable moments too, like the building of a lavish papal palace, cardinal houses only slightly more modest, even a papal zoo populated with exotic animals, lavish parties, plenty of women, endless hunting, and lots of bling. My predecessors didn't know what it meant to be pope, one of the Avignon pontiffs allegedly said, speaking of the high life that he lived. The Avignon papacy wasn't just a 70-year-long party, though. Many, though not all of these popes certainly played hard, but they also worked hard too. A few were committed reformers who tried to reverse the loose living of the cardinals and the church corruption which extended down the ranks. But they were few and unsuccessful in their efforts to bring about change. Far more of them kept busy with the business of administration. The Avignon papacy saw an unprecedented burgeoning of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The papal chancery, which churned out official letters and other documents, the fiscal apparatus of the church became well-oiled administrative machines, and ones that were very profitable. They raked in the money in the form of taxes, payments for lucrative appointments, assorted other levies and fines. Much of the money that didn't end up in personal expense accounts were funneled into military ventures, aimed to try to bring under control the area in central Italy known as the Papal States. And I think I've got the slide right there. The area in purple covers the territory that in theory was under the control of the Pope, but it was not at all under the control of the popes in the 14th century. The popes for a long time had been territorial rulers as well as spiritual leaders, though, as I said, in theory more than in practice. And that emphasis was very much on the theoretical during the Avignon papacy. While the popes resided there, the government of the Papal States had deteriorated into a political free-for-all, with papal representatives being overthrown by powerful local lords, mercenary captains, defiant town governments, all vying for independence from their papal overlord. The Pope's attempts to fight back, to win back their territory, made little headway ultimately. Indeed, it was their inability to maintain control over Rome that was one of the reasons why the popes lingered so long in Avignon. When the papal curia, or court, finally did cross the Alps, the homecoming proved for many of the cardinals to be both unhappy and unexpectedly brief. After disputing in vain the election of a Roman aristocrat as pope, the French contingent of cardinals packed their bags, headed back to Avignon, promptly elected their own rival pope, and excommunicated his Roman rival. The 39-year civil war that followed came to be known as the Great Schism. Two popes reigned simultaneously, each claiming to be the true one, each excommunicating the other and his followers, and dividing Europe into competing obediences. The Great Schism made a mess of that well-oiled administrative machine the Pope's Avignon predecessors had worked so carefully to construct, and it turned upside down the spiritual lives of a generation of Europeans who didn't know whether the Pope, the bishop, the priest that they pledged allegiance to could actually do what they claimed, namely save their souls. This dire situation was only definitively resolved by the intervention of secular rulers who bargained for extended powers over the churches in their own territories, and by essentially inventing an entirely new concept of church government. Before this time, church doctrine held that the Pope was the sovereign ruler of the church, and he could be judged by no one but God. Late in the 14th and the early 15th century, in response to this crisis of the schism, a new idea took shape, that the whole church, represented by a council, was the real head of the church. And at certain times, such as a crisis of papal leadership, that council could take over. On the basis of this conciliar theory, a council duly assembled deposed the rival popes and anti-popes, and in 1417 elected a brand new one. There we are. Martin V. It is with the reign of Martin and his definitive return of the papacy to Rome that we mark the beginning of the Renaissance papacy. Now, this whirlwind tour of the 14th century is crucial background for our imminent tour of the Renaissance papacy. From this sketch, it should be eminently clear that when the popes came back to Rome, they came back limping, battered and bruised. Their moral authority had all but evaporated. In practical terms, their spiritual power had been whittled away by European monarchs. It had also been dramatically usurped by the council, who practiced its sovereignty when it deposed popes and elected a new one. And while the council that elected Martin V had no plans to phase out the papacy or stage a takeover, they established decrees that required the Pope to summon a council at regular intervals and to share with him responsibilities for pressing issues of the Church, such as reform. Last, but certainly not least, this visit to the 14th century demonstrates that the Renaissance papacy was saddled with what today we would call a major image problem. What you've learned here about the papacy in the 1300s does something more, however, than just paint a portrait of embattled popes. It's also crucial because it gives us important tools for understanding just why the popes in the Renaissance were Jekyll and Hyde figures. The long 14th century, in many ways, served as a crucible in which new definitions of good pope were developed and traditional ones were reinforced and gained strength. And now it's time to meet some of these popes. Our tour will focus primarily on three, but in the course of discussing them, I'll fold in references to many others whose visions of good popes and bad are closely related to the three at the forefront. Meet Julius II, nicknamed Il Papa Terribile. Now, we shouldn't translate that literally. In Italian, it actually means not terrible, but one who instills terror, one who is to be feared. And Julius was to be feared because of what he did on the battlefield. Stay tuned for what he did as patron of the arts. He focused his attention during his pontificate first and foremost on consolidating his power over the papal states. He did so personally by suiting up in armor and leading his troops onto the battlefield. Julius wasn't the only Renaissance pope committed to regaining, or rather committed to making the title of prince more than just a title. Ever since Martin V took the throne in 1417, Renaissance popes had immersed themselves in costly wars up and down the Italian peninsula and gotten tangled in its head-spinning chessboard diplomacy, all for the sake of building a stronger state. So, what kind of label did Julius and other princes, rather would-be princes, because they hadn't really established that authority yet, what kind of label did they earn from their Renaissance contemporaries? Well, terribile doesn't actually mean terrible, but there were plenty of people who thought Julius was precisely that. Julius and others like him too. Bad does not even begin to express the vitriol that was poured out against this pope and some of his Renaissance predecessors. Take Lorenzo Valla, one of the most outspoken, one of the most incisive intellectuals of Renaissance Italy. In the middle of the 15th century, he penned a work that helped to expose one of the documents on which the Pope grounded his claim to temporal power as a forgery. He also took the opportunity in this text to condemn why, in practice, as well as in theory, as well as legally, the popes had absolutely no business being princes. And I'll read you a few choice lines from Valla's poisonous pen. The Pope claims he is allowed to separate by any means the patrimony bestowed by Constantine upon the Church from those who have possession of it, as if the Christian religion would be blessed by his taking it over and not more oppressed by every kind of crime, indulgence, and licentiousness, provided that it could be still more oppressed and more criminality could still be accommodated. The Pope is vicar of Christ alone, and not of the emperor as well. And that those dreadful phrases are heard no more. The church faction, the anti-church faction, the church fighting against Perugia, against Bologna. The church should not fight against Christians. It is the Pope who fights. The church fights against spiritual wickedness in high places. At that time to come, the Pope will be called and really will be a Holy Father, a father of all, a father of the Church. He will not provoke wars among Christians, but through apostolic censure and papal majesty, bring an end to the wars provoked by others. Because of his aggression, his success, and his personal participation in battle, Julius II was easy prey for another formidable thinker of the Renaissance in Northern Europe, Erasmus, though his authorship of this work is still contested. Julius Exclusus, a dialogue between Pope Julius II and Peter, as in St. Peter, as in the first pope, according to Catholic tradition, who holds the keys of heaven. Julius Exclusus means Julius excluded, as in excluded from heaven. What Erasmus recounts is how the Pope, upon his death, marches to the pearly gates, decked out in his customary armor, only to find St. Peter is none too intimidated by his terribilità, and that despite all of his efforts to bribe him, to threaten him, the first Pope Peter does not let him pass the gates. Behind this outrage and mockery lies one of the definitions of good pope that had tremendous currency in the Renaissance. A pope who stood apart from secular affairs, who focused exclusively on his pastoral duties. Now, the idea of pope as universal pastor, of course, is the most basic job description he had, found in the Bible. The Pope was to be a shepherd, so Jesus defined. Feed my sheep, he said to Peter and to his apostles. This model, the shepherd, was to be how the apostles were to carry out Jesus' mission. The apostolic idea of the church, and of the papacy's leadership of it in particular, was held up even higher, invoked more urgently, and given still greater priority in the Renaissance. And it took all sorts of different forms, the most extreme being that the Pope should abdicate from his position as prince and sell off all the property that belonged to the church. The reasons for the popularity of this definition of good pope can be traced in part to what happened in the 14th century, when the papal states had proven to be a money pit, into which popes drained untold funds drawn from the faithful of all ranks. Moreover, the popes had been so focused on their tasks in defending their authority in the papal states that they had failed to tackle the corruption riddling the hierarchy of the church and attending to other aspects of their spiritual job. Naturally, this commitment to the apostolic ideal only grew in the 1430s, when reports filtered in of a cardinal viciously slaughtering fellow Christians on the battlefield. and then of popes themselves joining them, and more generally, with those pontiffs chronically embroiled in the wars and games of musical alliances that consumed the Italian states. How was this the vicar of Christ, a title the popes had given themselves? How were these warriors princes of peace? Seems a pretty clear-cut case. A pope as a prince is a bad idea. The only way a pope could be good was if he shed these responsibilities. Indeed, the more puzzling question, it would seem, one that deserves our attention, is how could the popes be so reckless, so brazen about their badness? But at the same time as the papal prince was roundly being condemned, and increasingly so as the Renaissance period wore on, it was by others being embraced as the very opposite, as the ideal. And not surprisingly, that endorsement came from primarily within the papacy itself. The vast majority of Renaissance popes were convinced that the best popes were powerful princes. For centuries, beholden to others for protection, the pontiffs had often found themselves invaded by their supposedly loyal defenders. But it was the experience of the 14th century in particular that hardened the resolve of the Renaissance popes to make state building their priority. As papal control over their territories unraveled, neighboring Italian states were consolidating their power and eyeing papal lands for potential expansion, a pattern that was being repeated on a still larger scale north of the Alps. And with that interest in expanding into papal territory, especially coming from France. In this shifting political landscape, Renaissance popes concluded that the only way to protect the independence they had as spiritual authorities was to become princes themselves. If the pope wasn't a prince, their reasoning went, he wouldn't be a pope for very long either. The ongoing struggle to achieve this goal over the course of the 15th century only strengthened the resolve that people like Julius had at the beginning of the 16th. In the 1430s, for example, uprisings in Rome forced Pope Eugenius IV to flee the city down the Tiber River, disguised as a Benedictine monk and pelted with fruit and rocks as he left. He camped out in Florence for almost 10 years. His successor, Nicholas V, narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. And during the reign of Pius II, things got even messier. Rome came under siege from a pack of delinquents allied with rebellious lords around the city. They took over the Pantheon, made it their headquarters, and wreaked havoc in the city for months. And that was, in fact, the least of Pius's worries, who watched France invade Naples to the south and gain greater influence in Italy to the north. Julius had had unprecedented success in making the papal states one of the most powerful in all of Italy, in making great strides in his own ambitions based on the popes who had come before him. But it was a triumph that did not last. In 1527, in perhaps the most dramatic moment of papal weakness in the face of foreign forces, German mercenary troops sacked the city of Rome. The Pope had to escape the Vatican Palace through a secret corridor that led to the Castel Sant'Angelo, and he was holed up in there while German soldiers pillaged and plundered the city and scratched the name of Martin Luther on Raphael's frescoes. If Rome itself was sacked, the papacy's vision of what a good pope was as a powerful prince remained strong. And it remained a defining element of their vision of a good pope, one that stood in direct opposition to the apostolic model of so much of the faithful. Pope Pius II, my pope, as I call him often, stands out from the papal crowd for many reasons. And one was that his vision of what makes a good pope was all over the map. He began his ecclesiastical career as a conciliarist and played a prominent role in the council that assembled in the middle of the 15th century, one very hostile to the pope. When the council started stripping the Pope of his revenues, taking away other aspects of his authority, and eventually decided to depose him and elect a new one, it was Pius, then Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini, who was the council's and the anti-pope's central spokesman. For reasons I can't get into right now, he shifted camps and became one of the most vociferous critics of councils. And after a meteoric rise through the ranks, found himself in 1458 on the papal throne. Pius's idea of a good pope had come into focus. Pius's idea of a good pope that he followed as a pope himself, as I say, it shifted over the course of his life and career. That idea was defined 5 years before his pontificate began, with the fall of Constantinople to Sultan Mehmet II, the leader of the Ottoman Turks, who had invaded and conquered the city and then set sight on conquering Western Europe. Just to give you some orientation, there is Constantinople. The popes had long been leaders of crusades. In fact, leaders since the first one began in the 11th century. For them, leading a crusade was the essence of being a good pope. They were defending the Res Publica Christiana, the entity called Christendom, its traditions, its institutions, its beliefs, and its very existence. And with it, they were protecting God himself, the popes thought. So launching a crusade in retaliation against the Ottoman Turks was the most important job the popes could do, so Pius thought, protecting his flock from the Muslims, poised to destroy the Christian faith. And he had some reason to fear. They had already made their way to the Adriatic and were at the doorstep of Hungary, where political instability made it a very soft target. But there were other reasons why leading a crusade was appealing to Pius and some of his fellow Renaissance popes as well. It was an ideal way for the papacy to reestablish its relevance and its authority in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to the idea of a church having an absolute monarch. But the popes who were crusaders were usually demonized, the worst popes ever. Not because they cultivated any kind of benevolence toward the Muslim religion did people come to this conclusion, though there were some states, like Venice, whose trade empire hinged on good relations with the Ottomans, that were willing to turn a blind eye to what was going on. On the contrary, there were several European rulers, including the Pope's arch-rival, King of France, who tried to spearhead their own expedition against the Turks. So why exactly was it then that crusading popes were so bad? Because their campaigns were a mask, a facade for ugly ulterior motives. Crusading took money. Money that often came from indulgences. You could pay for an indulgence and reduce the amount of time you spent in purgatory for your sins. Money that came in the form of heavy taxes on the clergy and the laity alike. For the rulers of Europe, crusades also required them to acknowledge their subordination to papal authority, at least crusades led by the Pope. And this was something that they had been fighting against with some success for more than a century. When Calixtus III, who was the predecessor of Pius II, announced that he was going to impose a crusading tax on laymen and clergy, the rulers of Western Europe and many clergymen from across Northern Europe pulled out one of their favorite weapons, a lethal one for the popes. They threatened to call a council. Pius II learned from Calixtus, and he was more cautious, he treaded more lightly, and yet he still met with defiance and rebellion. he invited European rulers to a congress to discuss how to organize the crusade. Many princes were no-shows. Others wandered in late, and they offered no definitive support for the endeavor that he sought to get off the ground. He bemoaned the fact that everyone thought he was spending money only on himself when trying to collect taxes for the crusade. There was no way to change their minds, he writes. They think that it is all for my personal benefit. The damage had been done. The memory of the abuses, in particular, they're not exclusively those from the 14th century. Pius didn't back down on his conception of what made a good pope or on his actions to carry it out. He was able to win some support, summoned the ships to meet him at a port in northern Italy. Frail and sick, he appeared himself only to die as the ships began to assemble. Many simply stood him up, and those who arrived left as soon as the Pope had passed away. The ideal, once again, of a crusading pope being a great pope, a good pope, was one that Pius not only held on to personally, but also represented as being the ideal in a work of history that I will talk about in a few minutes. Any of you who have queued up around the endless walls of Vatican City in order to get into its museums have this fellow to thank for it, Nicholas V, an extremely learned pope steeped in the literature and history of ancient Rome, which dominated the intellectual culture of Italy, a talented diplomat and seasoned veteran of the church when he himself arrived on the papal throne in 1447. It was Nicholas who built the walls around the Vatican, who built the Vatican Palace, who created the spaces that eventually would become the Vatican museums you visit today. He was the first pope who commissioned Fra Angelico, one of the great painters of his day, to paint some of the private rooms, the private chapel inside the Vatican Palace, and also who began the work on the Vatican Library, an institution that would be continued by some of his successors. There were many others in the Renaissance who continued this building up of the city of Rome, and especially of the churches and of the Vatican, the areas that were religious centers in the city. Sixtus IV, let's just get to that slide. Sixtus IV, who designed, or rather who commissioned the design of the Sistine Chapel, named, of course, after him. And there were also the popes who commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's. And this was something that desperately needed to be done. This is an idea of what the original St. Peter's looked like, the original having been built many, many centuries before. And this looks like it's in excellent shape. The St. Peter's that the Renaissance popes found in the middle of the 15th century was literally collapsing, was a danger to enter. And so, for very practical reasons, the popes decided it was time to renovate. And there were other practical reasons why the popes invested so much time and money in rebuilding the city of Rome. When Martin V returned in 1417, Rome was a backwater, a village, the forum, a farmyard. Most of the city was abandoned, dilapidated. It was essential, therefore, to reestablish some basic infrastructure, which is exactly what many popes did, rebuilding roads and walls, bringing water into the city along aqueducts. It was a practical venture. But it was much more than that as well. Rebuilding Rome, inviting artists and architects to ply their trades in the city, were crucial ways to strengthen papal power. Who ruled Christendom? St. Peter's lets that message be known loud and clear. It is the Pope. That is the center of the church. And let's take a look again at these slides. The walls of the Sistine Chapel, often neglected by the visitors who are craning their necks instead to see Michelangelo's masterpiece on the ceiling. On the walls, the careful artistic program challenges, in not so subtle a way, at least not to Renaissance contemporaries, some of the competing visions of good pope. One who respects the council's authority as sovereign. Using Old Testament and New Testament scenes, Perugino, Botticelli, and other top-rated Renaissance artists made a case that the church had been destined by God to be ruled not by a council, but by an absolute monarch. And here we have an image of one of these paintings on the walls. Perugino's painting of Jesus handing the keys to St. Peter on the ground. Again, that idea of power being passed directly from Jesus to one man, to Peter, thought of and argued as the first pope, and therefore Peter passes down that authority through the lines of his successors. There's no question that these works of art and architecture dazzled the pilgrims who trooped into Rome starting in the middle of the 15th century for a jubilee. And there's also no question that the buildings and sculptures and paintings of these great artists won the admiration on at least one level of Europe's secular princes. We know this because when those artists weren't working for the popes, they were being commissioned by those very secular rulers. For example, Michelangelo's David, commissioned by the city of Florence, shows you how an artist admired, an artist who was working for the popes and doing paintings for him was one they would consider important enough to do an extremely important symbol of their very city. But the cultural legacy of the Renaissance popes spilled a dark stain onto the papacy as well. Again, in part because of what had happened in the 14th century. The Vatican Palace that Nicholas V built was a splendid place, but the people of the time couldn't help associate it with that other papal palace that had been built in Avignon and all the things that went along with it. A papacy that had been derailed from its proper course by magnificence and by its halls and halls for administrators. Once again, as well, these cultural investments represent diversions of precious money. Why was it being invested in such splendor when it could be turned towards the spiritual needs of the church? These questions were raised in particular about this building, which in its final form was actually completed after our period ends. In part, the construction of St. Peter's was paid for by a series of indulgences issued by Pope Leo X. Indulgences which caught the attention and fired the wrath of a certain Martin Luther. Among the 95 theses that he infamously nailed to that door, he included this one. Since the Pope's income today is larger than that of the wealthiest of wealthy men, why does he not build this church of St. Peter's with his own money, rather than the money of indigent believers? So the cultural glories of the popes ones which reflected so well on them, also reflected very badly in the eyes of very powerful and influential figures. I'm not suggesting that we should draw a straight line between the building of St. Peter's and the Reformation. But there is no question that in part what followed, the great schism that followed in the 16th century, was connected to these competing interpretation of the Pope as patron of high culture. Now, you may be thinking, where in all of this does Alexander VI fit in? There are many different answers to the question of who's a good pope and who's a bad pope in the Renaissance. But in their evaluations of Alexander, more precisely in some of the behavior that made him so infamous, Renaissance observers came as close as possible to the unanimous verdict of bad. One of the Avignon popes allegedly commented, as I said before, "My predecessors did not know how to live." And this was something, however, that made many Renaissance popes wince. Sure, some of them did dirty their hands selling offices to the highest bidder. Sixtus IV as well, the fourth Mr. Six, if you want to translate that literally, was involved in the plot to assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, rulers and great patrons of art in the city of Florence. But they were embarrassed collectively about other things, in particular the sexual mores of Alexander VI. And those popes went to great pains to emphasize that this was not their idea of what a good pope was all about. As a young cardinal, Alexander VI had already given a lot of headaches to Pius II, who worked very hard to discipline him. And Julius II had been so outraged at the behavior of Alexander that if he had been asked about Alexander, the question of was he a good pope or a bad pope, he might well have answered it the way Dorothy did. Why, he wasn't a pope at all. Why? Because Alexander was more interested in breaking down the papal states than building them up, in carving them up and making a dynasty, making a family dynasty that would control much of the territory that had long belonged to the institution of the church. The irony is that Julius II was so revolted by his Borgia predecessor that he refused to live in his Vatican apartments. And so he employed an up-and-coming painter by the name of Raphael to paint what would become his headquarters. Some of the most famous works of Renaissance art are located there, including the image, I don't have it right here now, of the School of Athens. So this, I think, in Alexander VI, and also in the attitude towards this pope and his legacy, this is where the ugly in the title of this lecture comes in best. In pursuing their ideal of pope, crusader, cultural leader, secular prince, the popes of the Renaissance were clearly taking a serious risk. They clashed in their vision of the papacy with the visions of many others, positioned powerfully to fight back and challenge their authority. These popes knew that, and they knew they had to do something about these competing visions of good pope. You can see this in the defensive tone that popes and their publicists take when talking about their idea of what it means to be a good pope. Nicholas V, for example, in his last will and testament, goes to great lengths to explain why he spent money building his Vatican palace, adorning churches with paintings, focusing so much on those works of art and architecture. It is to teach Christians about God. It is to let them experience their Christian religion in ways that they haven't been able to and couldn't be able to if they came to a dilapidated Rome. But we see the Pope's awareness of these conflicting visions of the good Pope most clearly and most systematically presented in the work of Pope Pius II. In the last year and a half of his 6-year papacy, he made time in an already impossibly busy schedule to write a 12-book account of his pontificate and the history of Europe at the time. In this text, Pius speaks directly to the clashing visions in currency at the time of what makes a good pope. Pius's background in diplomacy and in imperial politics made him someone who was well equipped to understand the consequences for the Pope of renouncing his own vision of what it meant to be a good pontiff, a crusader and a strong secular prince. And because of his educational training and his natural talents, no one was better equipped to build a defense of the papacy in the face of sharp criticisms. In writing this text, known as the Commentaries, Pius acted as a kind of one-man crisis management team for the Renaissance papacy. In this work, he builds a strong defense for the integrity of his crusading activities. And he also finesses it, so it looks like he was far more successful than he really was. He very explicitly casts himself as a secular prince, the diplomatic leader of Italy and its shield and defender, but he makes the case that his values and actions as a papal prince were compatible with his obligations as a spiritual commander-in-chief of Western Christendom. It didn't prevent him from doing things like whipping the College of Cardinals into shape morally. It didn't prevent him from pursuing important pathways for spiritual reform. And his activities as prince, he claimed, didn't so much distract him from executing his spiritual obligations as they did help him build a strong foundation on which to do that important spiritual work. Indeed, in parts of the Commentaries, Pius goes so far as to suggest that his temporal rule actually enhanced his spiritual authority. The debate about the nature of the Renaissance papacy, what makes a pope good, what makes a pope bad, was a defining element of the experiences of so many of these Renaissance popes. But it also defined one of the most important texts from the Renaissance. The Commentaries by Pius II is hailed as one of the most significant pieces of history and of literature to come out of the 15th century, and it bears the imprint of the conflict at the center of today's talk. The Renaissance papacy is sometimes referred to as the Restoration papacy, especially after the middle of the 15th century, when that council that Pius II had supported was eventually dissolved and no further councils appeared to challenge papal power. To me, the term restoration is a misnomer, not just because the specter of the council remained a very real threat for the rest of the period. Restoration emphasizes stability, it emphasizes tradition, a sense that the popes returned in the 15th century, much as they had been before. I see the period very differently, as one of a full-blown identity crisis. A crisis that centers around this question: what is a good pope? What is a bad pope? What I really wish I could do now is ask one person to join this discussion. What would Francis I think of the definitions of good pope presented here? What would he think of the definitions of good pope that his Renaissance predecessors had developed and defended? Pope as prince, pope as crusader, pope as patron of the arts. What would he respond, say, if someone asked him my Dorothy question? Do you think these were good popes or bad popes? Well, we can get some sense, perhaps, of what his answer would be, as much from what he has done himself as pope as from what he has explicitly said in response to such a question. In this image here, you see an empty chair. A chair reserved at a very special concert for the Pope. You could see various other important ecclesiastical figures, cardinals, right there by its side. The Pope was a no-show for this concert, apparently because he felt he had more important things to do than sit and listen to music. What he said, though not directly related to this concert, was that bishops should not be princes. And people have linked his desire to distance himself from these kind of activities as a desire to say, I am not a papal prince. What about Pope as crusader? Well, this image suggests quite the opposite vision of what makes a good pope. Francis stunned the world on Holy Thursday of this year by washing the feet not just of women, which was unprecedented, but also of Muslims. And while he is a man of great culture and learning, candidly he has spoken that he's a big fan of Fellini, Caravaggio, and Wagner, he has also done what Renaissance popes would have considered unthinkable. Passed up living in the apartments decorated by Raphael and among others, and the architectural greatness of the Vatican Palace for this, a sparsely decorated guest house. Obviously, when he was drawing up his own job description, he did not look to Pius II or Nicholas V or Julius II, just to name a few. But does that mean he would have thought what would make him a bad pope necessarily would have made the Renaissance popes bad as well? That's the question that makes me wonder. And the reason why is this. Pope Francis is clearly someone who gets that the Pope's job description must be made to accommodate the times. And what he has done so far in his pontificate suggests he is doing just that. It's no accident that at a time when the Church is seen as out of touch, when it has alienated Catholics and non-Catholics alike with its various scandals, banking and sex abuse scandals to name just a few, that he chose to model himself on a 13th century saint, St. Francis, who dedicated his life to serving anyone and everyone, who bathed and kissed the wounds of lepers, who embraced the destitution of the urban poor, who got into the crowd when he preached. That's why he takes selfies. Why he picks up the telephone to call regular people who are suffering and marginalized by society, even by his own church. Why he has spoken harshly against the capitalism that is destroying, he thinks, in many ways, the world of today, and why he has spoken in non-judgmental ways about gays. If he had been elected, say, instead of Julius, instead of Pius, instead of Nicholas, would he have followed the same path? His vision of the papacy today? One that is very similar in many ways to that endorsed enthusiastically and widely across Western Europe at the time, but that in the eyes of Renaissance popes, many of them anyway, was at the very least incomplete, if not dangerous. I doubt I'm ever going to find out Francis's answer to the Dorothy question, but I think I have a better idea now of how to answer it myself. The next time someone asks me if my pope was a good one or a bad one, I'll answer them in the same way my 2.5-year-old son answers either-or questions, with a very definitive yes. In his case, it's because he doesn't understand what the question means. In my case, it's because I think I do. It's a question that can't be answered easily, that needs to be recognized as tricky. So the yes answer is meant to be provocative, in a good way, to spark conversation about the messy relationship between the highs and the lows of a fascinating period in the history of the Church, of Italy, and of art and architecture. In my talk today, I hope I've laid out for you some of that messiness. And I hope that we can continue that conversation right now. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions for? I'm sure we have questions, and we have one here. Are we coming up to the microphones? There's one right here, and I'm not sure if there's a microphone on the other side of the room. I don't think so. So, all right. Thanks for coming up to the microphone.
Coming down and up to the microphone.
That's why I exercise every morning. I just wanted to make two comments. One about Pope Pius II and then about the current Pope, Francis.
Sure.
Pius II, I noticed when you mentioned that he was fomenting this new crusade, you forgot to mention that he actually, through his own written propaganda, was the one who popularized Count Dracula. And this is a very, everybody would know this reference, and yet you left it out. I'm curious as to why you did that. And he actually extolled the virtues of Count Dracula, how drinking the enemy's blood would be a good thing for Christianity, and on and on and on like this. This is rather startling stuff. The other thing that was very frustrating that I didn't hear from you about Pope Pius II was that he said in the Azores, which was contested between Spain and Portugal, off the coast of Africa, that newly converted slaves who were newly converted to being Catholics could not be enslaved, but everybody else who was a slave who didn't convert could still be a slave. That was okay. I mean, if you had told people, everybody here, that this Pope was in favor of slavery, the reputation would have gone into the toilet. The cloaca is, I believe, the Latin answer. The Latin word for toilet. As Martin Luther knows, that's where he had his revelation while he was sitting on the cloaca. Now, the current Pope, he's made some very nice speeches. He smiles very nicely. He hasn't handed over one document about the rape of thousands of children all over the world. Now, you used the word abuse. Let's call it what it is. We're talking about rape. Boys and girls all over the world by people who call themselves fathers. He hasn't handed over one document to any police, any prosecutor general. He hasn't instructed any of his bishops or any of his priests to dial 911 whenever they hear of this. In what sense is this man good for humanity? He's terrible, and you've all been given a snow job. All he's done is make some speeches. He hasn't changed one canon law. It's all PR. And I'm beginning to wonder, because you were so gentle on these people, these crimes against humanity, I'm beginning to wonder, I think we need to know this. Are you a Catholic yourself? We need to know this. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
My purpose in giving this lecture is in no way whatsoever to be an apologist for popes past or present. My job here, and as a historian, is to try to explain why popes might apologize for themselves the way that they did, and why there are a lot of people out there who didn't buy it. And certainly one of the points of my lecture today, captured in the title, was that there were many, many people in Europe in the Renaissance, and including some popes themselves, who thought very badly of the actions of the Renaissance popes. So I'm trying to show both sides. I'm not taking sides myself. And in reporting the way in which Francis I has been received, once again, I'm casting no judgment here. I am merely reporting the way people have received him as documented by the popular media. And there is quite clearly, and as I noted myself, no unanimous verdict about Francis, especially given that he is at the very beginning of his pontificate. So I think I'll leave it at that, just re-emphasizing where I stand as a historian and that in no way am I trying to buy into the good and bad definitions that I've presented here today.